Is a confession to a minister, priest, or spiritual advisor admissible as evidence in a court of law? That question is as old as Rome itself. In Roman law, spiritual confessions were exempt from evidence, and if a priest revealed anything learned during a confession, he would be punished. And it might surprise you to learn that even now only 5 states have laws requiring clergy to report serious crimes like murder or child abuse. And those states are North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Texas, and West Virginia. Catholic priests are required, on pain of excommunication, not to inform anything revealed during confessional. If a crime is disclosed during confession, it's a violation of the seal of confession if the priest reveals anything that would betray the penitent. And if that should happen to conflict with the law of the land and the priest goes to prison, that's just part of his vocation and must be accepted. In 44 states, clergy have ecclesiastical privilege, a right similar to attorney-client privilege, allowing them to refuse to disclose any admission made during confession. That's not to say that priests and preachers never report crimes, and even if they don't report them themselves, they're often instrumental in convincing the penitent to confess their crimes to the authorities.
How are you? I feel like it's been forever.
It has been forever. You had a beautiful wedding.
Congratulations, Journey and Elijah.
And if you're interested in seeing the picture, we have it on our Facebook page.
Yeah.
So, yep, check that out. Tell us what you're drinking this morning.
I'm drinking a caramel apple latte from the table here in Asheboro. Oh my goodness. It has all those fall vibes. I love apple. I know you're not a fan.
I'm not a big apple fan. However, I have a confession to make in our next episode about the apple stuff.
Well, what are you drinking?
I'm having a sweet baby brown. Now, this is cold. I think it's got like some brown sugar and like their own little concoction. I've had several of their special concoctions. They are always delicious. But I've had this one several times. So I already knew that I was going to like it, but it's hard for me to veer from my tried and true.
Right. I like the brown sugar shaken espresso from Starbucks. So I wonder if that's
You would
similar.
love this.
Okay, yeah.
You would love this.
I love that caramel flavor of the brown sugar. So that sounds really good. And I love the table.
Yes. So my husband and I went out there for date night a couple of weeks ago. They had some live music out on their patio. It was really good. So I want to give a shout out to Dusty, the owner of the table. It's a great place for locals to go and gather and just hang out and talk. You'll never go when it's a slow time because our community loves the table.
Yeah, it's just a great place.
Yes. So thank you to them for sponsoring today's episode.
Yes, thank you. So this story took place in Reidsville, North Carolina.
Okay, not far from here.
In the 1920s, Reverend Thomas F. Pardue was a young primitive Baptist evangelist. He traveled all over North Carolina holding these old-time tent meetings. Have you ever been to a tent revival?
I have. I went to a summer camp one time with my dad, and they had like a tent revival that week.
Okay, yeah. I went to an old-fashioned Pentecostal tent revival when I was a little girl with my grandma Thomas in Avon Park, Florida. I'll never forget it. So Reverend Pardue was a young preacher from Yadkin County who felt the call of God to preach the gospel from an early age. His heart was, he wanted to reawaken the communities for God. His preaching style earned him the nickname Thunderbolt Tom.
We could use some preachers like that today.
Yes, we could.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking too soon. I don't know where this story's going. I'm going to hold off on my comments.
He was straight to the point, and he did not hold back from the truth, even if the truth wasn't popular. He said it was his job to preach the word, and it was God's job to do the rest, to work in their hearts. And, he wasn't concerned with popularity. In 1925, he did a tent meeting in Madison, North Carolina. Pardue passionately preached a sermon there saying that the trouble with the church and religious denominations were found in its weak members. He said there were too many church members of the watery type. and that it would never be any better until a strong wind blew the brethren of little faith into a place where their faith could be rooted and grounded in Christ.
Amen.
Yeah. He did his best that night, as he did every time he preached, to explain the great love that God had for the world, in that he gave his only son so that we might be justified by faith in he who paid the ultimate price for our souls. He spoke about the assurance of salvation, the joy and peace of mind that only belongs to those who are justified in Christ. Hundreds would flood the altars as the choir leader played the piano and led the revival attendees in singing "Love That Will Not Let Me Go." New converts, convicted, black and white, side by side, repented of their sins as they cast their burdens onto Jesus and made these beautiful professions of faith. I can just see it.
And we really could use a revival like that in our world today, for sure.
Absolutely. And if you listen to our very first episode, it was about the Lawson family who was from Madison. And you know that Charlie Lawson and his family would have lived in Madison while this revival was going on.
Oh, wow. What a great connection.
Yes. And so, of course, I couldn't help but wonder if any of the Lawson family members might have been there.
Wow.
During that revival. Those revivals were a big deal.
Yeah, and these are small towns.
Very small. And I mean, they drew thousands. So it's very possible that they were there. The Lawson family, some of them could have been impacted by the Reverend Pardue's preaching. And then, of course, we know that just 4 years later, on Christmas Day in 1929, that terrible tragedy would happen. So if you haven't listened to the Lawson family episode, our very first one, go back and
go give that one a listen.
So anyway, in the spring of 1927, Reverend Pardue went to another tobacco growing town, Reidsville, North Carolina, to hold a revival in the big McCollum tobacco warehouse. There was a young woman by the name of Alma Gatlin who faithfully attended these meetings. She wasn't Baptist, she was Church of Christ, but he was charismatic and his preaching really impacted her. She loved it. So one evening, Pardue preached this message on the subject of confessing your sins. And after the service, about 50 men and women hung around to have a talk with him. Alma was one. She let all the others go first, and then when it was her turn, she broke out into sobs. She was obviously troubled. Alma kept saying that she didn't think that she could be forgiven because of this big sin that she'd committed. Pardue tried to comfort her and told her that, she hadn't committed an unpardonable sin. He encouraged her to confess and unburden herself. She said, "But I've committed the biggest sin that there is." Pardue felt like this was probably a case of someone feeling excessive guilt.
Right.
So he said, "Alma, you have not committed the biggest sin." "I have," she told him. What have you done that's so bad?" "I've murdered someone." He just stood there stunned for a minute. This was a first for him.
I'm sure most pastors don't relish the thought of someone confessing murder to them.
Right. And then he thought, okay, she's young. And he figured that she had probably gotten herself in a situation before she was married with a baby. And this had something to do with that. And so he led the conversation in that direction. And she said, "No, Reverend, that's not what happened." He said, "Look, come on, let's go up into the choir loft," because there were people around. And they asked, what happened? And she said, I killed my pa." He's, again, just stunned. And he said, "You didn't." He consoled her the best that he could while just kind of being in this state of shock. And then he made an appointment with her for the next day so that the two of them could talk in private.
Okay.
There, she gave him the details, and the details were terrible, and they were gruesome. So Pa
is this our disclaimer? Gruesome details are coming? Okay.
I mean, we've done worse.
Okay.
But, yeah. Pa's name was Smith T. Petty. He was born in 1886 in Union County, South Carolina. He had 11 siblings, and like we always say on this podcast, those were some hard times. He was from a poor family and went to work when he was just a little boy at neighboring cotton mills where his family lived. And that was just, we've mentioned before, that was common practice.
Yeah, way of life.
It was. Kids worked to support their families in those days. As he got into his teens, he started drinking. And before long, his drinking interfered with his work to the point that he often had to move around to be able to keep work. He'd lose a job due to being drunk or hungover or mouthy from drinking, and then he'd have to go find another job somewhere else. As his alcoholism got worse, sometimes he would go on a bender and just disappear for weeks at a time. Then, of course, whatever job he had would have been lost, and then he'd have to hunt down work somewhere else. So this was just kind of this cycle. But he usually stuck to working in cotton mills. He knew that kind of work, and he was good at it when he was sober. When Smith was 24, he was working at a mill in Grayson County, Virginia, when he met and became smitten with a young girl named Janie Temple Bratton. She was 17 years old. Smith won her over. They were married, and she was pregnant with Alma really soon. Alma was born on August 30th in 1906. When she was born, the family lived, it was kind of near that North Carolina border.
With Virginia, yeah.
Yeah. The Pettys would go on to have another daughter and 2 more sons. Like my husband and I, they had 2 boys and 2 girls. Their lives were hard. They were poor, and mostly due to Smith's alcoholism and instability. I don't think he drank every day. He mostly went on benders.
Mm-hmm. And when you described it earlier, he obviously had that problem before he even got married. I wonder if she even realized, she's marrying an alcoholic, but...
And she was young.
She was 17 when they got married?
Yeah. And when he started, he just couldn't stop. So like I said, he didn't drink every day, but, when he got started, he was terribly abusive to Janie and to the kids, both physically and verbally. When he wasn't drinking, he still wasn't great because then he was stressed and depressed because of the financial situation that he'd gotten his family into when he'd been drunk and out of work.
Right. Self-medication, and then that, one thing leads to another.
This cycle. Mm-hmm. And then in January of 1920, alcohol became illegal in the United States.
Yes, prohibition.
Mm-hmm. Women, Christians, and progressives spearheaded the temperance movement because of situations like the Pettys.
And the last episode we did about Lizzie Borden, she was on one of those temperance movement leagues.
She was. Their intentions were to protect families from the horrors of drunkenness.
Yes.
Alcoholism had become a major social issue in the United States. Men abusing their families, abandoning them, or just too dang drunk to support them. Progressives, feminists, and Christians were united in their belief that alcohol was the root cause of most of the United States problems. Prohibition, they just believed that that was going to be the solution to the nation's poverty, crime, violence, deadbeat dad, everything.
Yeah. We do sometimes slip into that thought that we can legislate behavior, which we should have laws, absolutely, but you can't change a person's heart by legislation.
That's right.
And that's the real issue there.
It's a sin problem.
It is.
Because it becomes like whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
You're gonna knock down one issue and 100 more are gonna spring up, if that very one doesn't spring up even bigger. So as we know, that backfired.
Yeah.
And directly caused organized crime to thrive.
Yeah. And then the moonshining business.
Yes.
And then,
government corruption. It actually made people, I think, thirstier for alcohol.
Yeah.
It eliminated legitimate jobs.
Oh, yeah.
And tax revenue. Created that black market for alcohol. Yeah, like you said, moonshine running. It was just all around a bad idea.
Yeah.
Their hearts were in the right place. It's just not up to the government to babysit.
A lot of people, they saw the alcoholism as a problem, and it was.
Right.
But we also forget, but the alcohol itself, is the drunkenness that's the problem. That's a problem of self-control.
Had I been born back then, I may have been a part of the temperance movement myself.
Oh, I would have absolutely been.
You know,
Yes. Yeah.
so we have the benefit of
Hindsight.
history. Yeah, of
Hindsight.
hindsight. Exactly.
Right. Because obviously there have to be laws based on morality, like thou shalt not kill. But at the same time, you can't legislate every possible sin that a person can do. That is why it's about the heart.
We have constitutional rights.
Mm-hmm.
If your behavior infringes on my personal freedoms, then those are the things that need to be legislated. Like, you can't steal my stuff.
Right.
And you can't come murder me if you don't like me. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. I do agree with that. But boy, didn't we just jump into some social justice issues?
We did.
We didn't mean to go there.
No. Okay, so anyway, in 1920, at the beginning of Prohibition, the Pettys moved to Reidsville. And it seemed as though Smith had quit drinking when they made alcohol illegal. He actually landed a management position at the Edna Cotton Mill and was making really good money. The family were doing better than they had ever. I mean, they weren't wealthy by any stretch, but
things are looking up.
They were really looking up, yes. But by 1922, Smith was drinking again, and he had lost that job at the mill. So at this point, he would just leave town for months at a time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, supposedly working. I don't know if he was sending money back home or not. My Nana's daddy was a lot like Smith, and he would disappear on his family for weeks and months at a time, supposedly working, but nobody knew. He would just show back up when he needed something. One time he was gone for 3 years.
Oh, wow.
And he told my grandma that he had been in a tuberculosis sanatorium, but they believe he was in jail.
But she didn't get any letters while he was gone?
Nope, nothing.
And did he just come back like nothing had ever happened?
Just came back, and she always took him back.
Wow.
And he was very abusive as well to her kids. In 1922, Belk Stevens department store opened up in Reidsville, and Alma's mom, Janie, got a job there. It was a consistent job that she was very proud of. Most of the time, it was just Janie and the kids, and those were pretty good times. She was a good mom, and she loved her kids, and her kids loved her. Alma was growing up to be a popular, sweet, beautiful girl that everyone was friends with at school. But before she could graduate, both she and her younger sister, Thelma, had to drop out in order to take a job to help her mother out. At first, Alma worked at a local soda shop. Then she got a job at a local movie theater. While she was working there, this young man named Eugene Gatlin started working. He had moved to Reidsville from Greensboro just after World War I, and Alma noticed him right away. And it didn't take long for the two of them to start, going together to the soda shop and
sparking and courting.
Yes, exactly. Soon, they were even talking about marriage. Eugene volunteered at the local fire department, and eventually he was offered the position as fire chief.
Wait, I mean, like that?
Yes.
Quick?
Yeah, it was, which he, of course, happily accepted.
Yeah, where was that?
In Reidsville.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he ended up being the fire chief of Reidsville. And Alma became a dental assistant.
Okay.
And then with no college.
I was going to say, did she go to school for that?
She did not.
Okay, so those were hard times, but to be able to go from working as a movie theater attendant to a dental assistant, that's pretty good.
It really is.
Like, you couldn't do that now. That's pretty good job promotion there.
And I really think those were the days when hard work would get you somewhere.
And your work ethic.
Yeah. It had less to do with your education and more to do with your work ethic and probably your willingness to learn and
your quality of work and all of those things.
Exactly. This was just before the Depression. And so I think it was economically, we didn't know how bad it was, but it was probably not great. But I think people could do okay.
Yeah.
So life just kind of went on without Smith when he wasn't there. He came home from time to time when he'd lost a job and needed to regroup until he found work somewhere else. But he was gone an awful lot. So in 1926, when Smith disappeared, nobody really paid attention. But then in March of 1927, Janie, Smith's wife, Alma's mother, got pneumonia and did not survive. Family tried in vain to find Smith Petty, but they were not able to get in touch with him. They sent letters to try to get a hold of him in towns that they knew he had been in, but radio silence. At this point, his dad and some of his brothers were beginning to worry about him. Just wondered, did he run into danger wherever he was at or whatever?
Or could he have been locked up somewhere in jail?
Exactly.
In another town?
They just didn't know what to think because, yeah, he did disappear sometimes, but missing your own wife's funeral, that's another level.
Right.
Then in May, the Pardue revival came to town and Alma made her confession. When she went to see the Reverend the next day, remember I said they had made that appointment?
Yes, for the private conversation.
Mm-hmm. He claims she laid the whole story out to him. He would later say that while Alma didn't seem any different towards him, and she seemed able to just move on from what she had done, he was having a lot of trouble. He was so confused about what to do. Alma had trusted him, and he didn't really want to break her trust, but she had just confessed to a murder.
Right.
Doesn't he owe it to the citizens of Reidsville to take that to the police? While he was debating, praying, and just kind of agonizing over what he should do, Alma was planning her wedding to Eugene. On July 10th, the couple were married by the Reverend Pardue. And then shortly after, he made the decision to go to the police. The police thought that he was just looking for attention. They did not believe him.
The pastor?
Yeah, they didn't take him seriously. They were like, oh, this crackpot.
Kind of odd.
Yeah, it really was. So they didn't do anything. They didn't even investigate it to begin with. Then he's going to other people like, hey, this girl confessed to me. He did not
continue to pursue. Okay.
He continued. He got so frustrated that he wrote a letter to the governor and it was still ignored.
Wow. Okay. The governor ignored it?
The governor ignored it. So finally he drove to Greensboro to talk to a man named Charles Knoll. It was actually at a detective agency over there. He believed Pardue and he wanted to look into it. Through a little bit of manipulation, they went to the papers and just said, hey, these cops are really being negligent and they're not taking us serious. Then they were like, well, we have been investigating this. We just wanted to keep it quiet.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
Had she told the pastor her motive, like why she killed her pa?
She had. And I'll get into it.
But you're not going to share it yet. Okay.
Yeah. There's discrepancies.
Because I'm thinking, well, maybe people are ignoring him because, I don't know, maybe if there was really bad abuse, they didn't.
They know the situation.
Yeah. And they thought, okay. I don't know. I mean, not that that's okay, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like maybe they were having a little sympathy for her.
After a while, Pardue ended up giving his statement to the police and to the reporters. He said that when they met privately the next day, he encouraged Alma to unburden herself and to tell the whole story. This is what he says she told him.
Okay.
The night before the murder, Alma walked into her house after work and heard her father yelling at her mother. She ran into her mother's room where she saw her father choking her mother. She had already vowed to herself to murder her father because he had whipped her a few years earlier. I guess it was a really bad whipping. She was like, I'm going to kill him.
Yeah, like if this happens again.
Yes.
Yeah.
She tried jumping on him to stop him from hurting her mother, but he knocked her down. He threatened to kill her, and she yelled out for her sister, Thelma, and her cousin, a teenage girl that was staying there. Her dad was drunk. So the three of them were able to
restrain
him somewhat. But then he managed to get the upper hand and he beat the tar out of her with a belt. And she vowed, you know what? I'm killing him tomorrow. He's dead. So all night long, her father screamed and yelled and threatened everybody, keeping everybody awake, beating on pots and pans, just being a belligerent drunk.
Yeah.
But so Alma got up early the next morning between 5 and 6. She went downstairs and got an axe from the basement. She hid the axe where nobody could see it. And then after her family went to work, Alma made her dad some scrambled eggs for breakfast. And while he was turned around eating, She came up behind him and hit him in the head several times with the axe.
Oof.
As hard as she possibly could. He slumped down, of course, to the floor. She could just hear him moaning and saying, "Why did you do this?" So she covers his mouth with her hand to keep the neighbors from hearing this.
Oh, my goodness.
And it took him like over an hour. At the very end, he asked her to pray for him.
Oh, my gracious.
Yes. So, of course, you can imagine the mess.
Uh-huh.
Because, first of all, head wounds. And second of all, axe murders.
Yeah.
That's just not so easy to clean up. But the Reverend said she told him that she burned her clothes. She burned her dad's clothes. She cleaned up the mess. She wrapped his body before eventually hiding and burying it in the basement in some ashes.
What year was that?
1927.
I think she had heard about Lizzie Borden.
I know.
Because that is similar.
Very similar. And then in September of 1927, authorities went to the house and they found his badly decomposed body. And it was exactly where Pardue had said it was going to be, in the basement in a pile of coal and ashes. Hundreds of gawkers, of course, they're coming out to see him.
Of
And
course.
how gross, because he's been dead for a long time. So anyway, they came and they were looking at him. In fact, one boy, a neighbor of theirs, saw when they brought out his body and saw the head wound on his head. And he ended up writing a book. Yeah.
Oh,
years
wow.
later, called Murder for Breakfast. Yeah. There's a book about this case.
And this is how true crime writers get their start.
Exactly. Again, he did have a big wound on the right side of his head that was believed to be the death blow, according to the doctor who examined his body. A funeral was held for Smith, and Reverend Pardue conducted the funeral.
He's very involved in their
He's
lives.
very involved. Smith's other children, his brothers and father, attended the funeral. Alma was arrested at the dentist office where she worked and was charged with the murder of her father. Alma was very sweet. Again, she was very likable. She didn't get excited or belligerent. She was just very composed, very kind. That held some weight with the sheriff, and it did the community as well. The sheriff was very sympathetic and kind to her. Everybody at the jail loved her. They let her bring in furniture. They let her hang up lace curtains.
This sounds like Mayberry.
She brought in 2 portraits of her mother. She had a picture of her husband. Yeah.
The fire chief?
Like the fire chief. Yeah. She painted the walls and the bars green.
She was just a little regular fashion designer over there at the jail.
She was, yeah. From the start, Alma had a lot of sympathizers who saw her as a brave and beautiful girl. A lot of people felt like that flamboyant reverend had manipulated her with a stirring sermon, had elicited her trust, talked her into giving him a full confession, and then turned around and betrayed her confidence by going to the police.
Girl, you got my wheels turning over here. I'm going,
Actually, I read article after article in the newspapers of the day questioning his ethics and just clergymen in general, betraying their parishioners' trust. That's kind of an ethical.
Yeah, but aren't they required to report a crime?
At that time, it was a big debate.
Okay.
I
I bet
mean-
today it's required. So, like, if the crime today was like a sexual abuse thing that happened,
Right.
I know that the pastors have got to report that.
In this case, I think they felt like he called her over.
Like he had manipulated it.
Yeah.
Well, and the fact that there's so many people questioning that makes me think, okay, they know something about this reverend I do not know. So,
She had a lot of sympathy.
okay.
Now, his colleagues agreed with him. I don't know. I mean, it is a question. It's an ethical question. But on the other hand, if that had been a man who had killed a child and had gone to the reverend, I would think, of course, he should tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm like, I hope nobody ever confesses a crime to me. I do not want to be put in that position.
Her situation to me was a little different. Anyway, we'll get into it.
Okay.
We'll talk about it. So again, they called him a sensation seeker, but he did have supporters too, like his own congregation. And in
Okay.
fact, he gained enough support there because he was just there for a revival. They ended up building a church that's still there today. Mind
Oh,
you. Yeah.
interesting.
So from the start, Alma maintained her innocence, though. She said she did not do it.
She said she didn't even kill her dad.
Yes. Her siblings regularly came to see her. They stood by her. Her husband and his mother fully supported her. Her grandfather, Smith's father, went to go see her in jail. He left the jail saying he did believe that she had killed her father, but there was more to it, and he did not believe that she had acted alone. Alma's trial began on February 13th in 1928 when she was 20 years old. One of her two lawyers, Percy Steers, made the statement, "Should a confession made in complete confidence to a minister be brought into court as evidence?" Then he pointed his finger at the Reverend and called him a witch-burning Judas.
Good gracious. Okay.
He said, "Let us have freedom to go to our pastors about the things that bear on our souls." However, Alma pled not guilty. She claimed that it was her mother and not her who had murdered her father. She admitted that, yes, she had told Pardue that she had committed the murder. She said that she did tell him that she had committed the murder, but she only said that to protect her mother's reputation. Alma said that her mother's salvation had weighed heavily on her since her death. She told the court she had begged her mother to confess to someone once she had become sick and knew that she was dying, but her mother had been too ashamed and afraid. So that night during the service, when Pardue was talking about confession, her emotions were stirred and she had to know if her mother had been forgiven. But to protect her, she claimed to be the murderer. Alma described life when her father was home, explaining how tense and violent things were. Over the years, her father's abuse had escalated and he was abusive to everyone in the house. Everybody was in danger. Her mother, her siblings. Alma said when she'd come home the night before the murder, her father was drunk and he was choking her mother. She said she, her sister, and her cousin, that teenage girl that I was telling you about, had tried to pull him off of their mother, and he cracked Alma over the head with a stool. For the rest of the night, he would cuss and holler and threaten the family. The next morning, January 10th, Thelma and Annie, the cousin, left and went to work. Alma's 15-year-old brother, Woodrow, went down to the basement and was cutting firewood like he always did. Alma was at the kitchen sink washing off with a cloth her face and her neck when her dad appeared, still drunk from the night before, with a butcher knife in his hand, threatening to cut her neck off. Then he lunged at her with the knife. Alma wrestled the knife away from him, and then he started choking her. Woodrow heard his sister screaming, and he ran up the stairs with the axe still in his hand. Their mother came running up as well, and she grabbed the axe from her son and hit her husband in the back of the head. He still had his hands around her neck, though, even though he had been hit once, so her mother hit him again with the death blow. Alma testified that her mother told her and her brother Woodrow to go on to work. When they returned home, everything was cleaned up. She said their mother told them she would kill herself if they ever told a soul about what had happened there that morning. Woodrow's testimony corroborated Alma's story.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, perfectly. And then in February, Janie, the mother, had suffered a miscarriage. The dad died in January. February, she had a miscarriage and then had a hard time recovering and came down with pneumonia.
Okay.
That progressively worsened. The doctor who attended to Janie testified for the defense, saying that he had personally witnessed Alma begging her mother to let her bring someone to the house so that she could do a confession as her life was coming to an end.
Okay, so for a while there,
Mm-hmm.
the way the Reverend was so wrapped up in their family, I thought, well,
Right.
maybe he did this and was trying to pin it on her, but she has admitted that she told him she did it.
Yes.
To cover for her mother. And it sounds like testimony's backing that up.
Yep.
Okay. I just want to make sure I was following the details. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So on March 9th, her mother died, never having confessed. The condition of her mother's soul weighed on her. I mean, she definitely loved her mother.
And I do think that's a plausible story.
Yeah. She explained that those events are what led to her false confession to the Reverend that May night. The trial brought up the interesting topic of the responsibility of spiritual leaders. Is their duty towards their parishioners who trust them with their souls, or is it to the public? You would be surprised how many people believed that Pardue was dead wrong for going to authorities. He went on the stand and had to defend himself. The prosecutors pointed out, they were like, you're going harder after him than you are defending her.
Yeah. Like it really became the question of whether he was in the right for reporting it.
He did go on the stand to defend himself, and he said, I didn't go right to the police. This took me months to think and pray through. He said he had lost over 10 pounds. He was grieved over it.
I bet. Yeah, I bet he did.
But ultimately, he did what he believed God and his conscience required him to do. Alma's attorneys said that he was seeking sensation while she had been in her hour of need. They pointed out the horrific abuse that she and her family had endured at the hands of her father. And then she had watched her mother, that she loved very dearly, die this slow death that Alma believed was from guilt and a broken heart. And then Alma went to her pastor with this heavy heart, to this man of God for comfort, and was betrayed by him. Knowing that if he succeeded in having her prosecuted, if she was convicted, she was going to the electric chair. They believed it was all for more publicity for him, that he could have cared less about Alma. Some of the Reverend's testimony was questioned, like he claimed that Alma said her father had talked to her after being hit in the head, saying, will you pray for me? And saying,
that's right.
Why are you doing this? That whole thing. She said she never said that. And the doctor who examined him post-mortem said that would not have been possible. They're kind of just calling him a liar. His story's inconsistent, but it's like, who do you believe? That's kind of what you're left with.
Yeah. And I don't think there's a basis for calling him a liar.
Right.
Per se.
The defense played on the sympathy of the jurors for sure. These were 12 men and this beautiful girl, sweet, beautiful girl at that, the fire chief's wife. He said that Alma would be executed if she were found guilty. Her lawyers went into detail explaining to the jurors what death by electric chair was like.
Oh, yeah.
So the prosecution then pointed out that although it was a well-known fact that Smith Petty heavily drank and even sometimes brawled outside his home, no one besides his children testified to ever having seen him physically abuse his family. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right. But I was thinking that's why she had so much sympathy from the other people, is because they knew of the abuse.
I don't think there was anybody outside the family. His kids said yes, he was abusive. And I believe it.
I do too, because, even if you don't actually witness it, when there have been people that you've known, like, oh, yeah, that guy, you can know that without having seen it, because the rumors and having seen the kids or the wife have marks on them and hearing maybe neighbors hearing yelling, like you can know that without actually saying that you've witnessed it.
Right. And he had been like in a street fight just a couple of days before he was killed. He was not this gentle man. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
At least not when he was drinking.
He had a reputation as being a mean drunk.
He did. Yes. So the prosecution pointed out how similar Alma and her brother Woodrow's stories were, and questioned, how they probably were coached by the attorney as what they were kind of.
Or they were both telling the truth.
Exactly.
One or the other, right?
Right. But ultimately the trial ended on February 22nd, and the jury was instructed that there were 3 possible verdicts: guilty of first-degree murder, and that would be the electric chair. So if they believed the Reverend's account, she would be guilty of first-degree murder. And then there was second-degree murder, and that would be if they believe she did do it, but it wasn't planned. It happened in the heat of the moment. She came in, saw her mother being choked. And then there was not guilty, and that would be if they believed her.
Okay.
So, and those were the only 3 possible verdicts. After a few hours, the jury had made their decision. It was quick.
Mm-hmm.
Alma had told family that she believed she was going to be found guilty. She had really kept her composure throughout the whole thing, but at that point, she just had kind of lost hope. She sat in the courtroom between her husband and her sister, visibly shaken. She was asked to stand for the verdict. Alma Petty Gatlin was found not guilty of murder.
I feel relief, and I don't know why, but
she burst into tears. Her husband just held her and cried with her for a couple of minutes. I mean, it was kind of a beautiful moment. And then she turned to her sister, and her sister hugged and cried. She tried through her tears to thank the judge and to thank the lawyer. She even actually spoke for a minute to the prosecutor, but she was so emotional. Mm-hmm. She was just overcome. And then after being in jail for 6 months, she got to finally, go home and be with her husband. The Reverend Pardue wasn't in court because the verdict had come back so fast. They weren't expecting it to come back that night. They actually had to go wake up the judge.
Oh, wow.
Because they were thinking, this was going to at least drag out till the next day. But it didn't. So there really weren't very many people in the courtroom, and Pardue was not in there. But when he heard what the verdict was, he said, well, I've fulfilled my duty to God and to society, and I just have to leave it there. Alma and her husband Eugene would leave Reidsville and move to Greensboro shortly after Alma gave birth to their first baby girl later that same year in 1928, a girl they named Frances Ann. Then they went on to have another daughter they named Betty Jean in 1932, and in 1935 they had a son, little Eugene Jr. Later, the family would move to Columbus, South Carolina, where they raised their children. At the age of 26, Alma said she truly received the gift of, it's going to make me cry, of eternal salvation through faith in Jesus. And it said that she spent the rest of her life experiencing the wonder of the love of Jesus Christ. Her obituary says that God used her as an instrument in the winning of many souls. Alma was a faithful member of the U Baptist Church there in Columbus, South Carolina. She was a homemaker until after she raised her children, and then she and Eugene opened up and ran the Gatlin's Rest Home, caring for the elderly, and they did that together for 25 years in the Columbus area.
Wow.
Eugene passed away in 1955. Alma outlived him and all of her siblings. She passed away in 2001 at the age of 95. The same year my grandma passed away.
Oh, wow.
And they were born the same year, too.
They had like parallel lives.
Yes.
Wow.
Now Reverend Pardue.
Mm-hmm.
The Depression began in 1929.
Yeah.
And in 1931, revenue officers drove up to the Reverend Pardue's house, where they found 9 gallons of whiskey.
Oh, my goodness.
Hidden under the house, and several empty pint bottles under a table in a room in his house. As officers were searching his residence, the Reverend drove up, and they found a case of empty pint bottles in his machine. I'm guessing that means his car.
Yeah.
He explained that unemployment had driven him to selling whiskey. His sister called on him because he had threatened her and tried to force her to give him money. Pardue was sentenced to 8 months on a roadside chain gang. He lived to be 75 years old and is buried in Yadkin County at the Oak Grove Baptist Cemetery.
Wow. I'm not laughing about that, but I'm like, okay, that was a twist I did not see coming.
And that is the end of that story. So what are your thoughts? Good men sin. So,
Absolutely.
they
we all
messed up. They falter. So I still don't think that has anything to do with what happened early on.
Right.
I think I would have understood if he had kept that, and I understood that he couldn't.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that she did it or that her mother did it?
I think she probably did it.
I think that her story is plausible that her mother did it, because I'm like, if she had done it herself, why wouldn't she have just claimed self-defense from the beginning? Like,
Right.
Like, he was beating me, and
Because then she would have been found guilty of second-degree murder.
she could have been found not guilty of in self-defense, couldn't she?
Back then...
No, you don't think so?
No, I don't think so. I think they would have...
I just feel like that story is a very odd way to give a defense, to come up with that.
I wouldn't have been able to find her guilty because I do think there's enough reasonable doubt there. Her story, like you said, it is plausible.
Yeah.
I don't know that I buy it because I'm just skeptical.
I kind of buy it because I think the truth is sometimes stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
And I just think the go-to would have been self-defense. Like, if people knew he was a mean drunk and that those kids had said he had beat them a lot, I would have thought she would have had a pretty good chance to get out of that with self-defense. So to come up with that crazy story that it was her mom and she was just going to the Reverend because she was worried about her soul, I'm like, I don't know. To me, that sounds like it's just weird enough that it might be true.
And it very well could have been. They were abused, and I believe that because, first of all, they all kept that secret in that house. The mom, sister, the cousin, the brothers.
But people seem to know about it, didn't they?
No.
She just elicited sympathy because she was sweet and composed?
Yeah. Most people did not believe she did it. They felt bad for her because they believed that she was abused. You know, once they heard her story, they believed her story that this was an abusive man, and they were very suspicious of the Reverend.
Well, and then back to that question about him, whether he should have reported it or not. I mean, that is a very hard, I think you do have a moral obligation to report a crime, but at the same time, he did report it and it wasn't taken seriously. So how much do you pursue that? Do you continue to push and push and push?
Yeah, he absolutely made to the point of wrote the governor.
Yeah.
He wrote newspaper articles
so it sounds like
criticizing
he
the
really
police.
did have a very deep conviction about it.
Yeah. Or did he just want publicity?
Right. Could it be that? I don't know. That's weird. But that's why I would hope I would never really be put in a position. Like, I'm thinking of priests who people come in and confess to them.
Yes.
Like, I would not want to be in a position where somebody confessed to me.
These 3 nuns wrote her. A lot of people wrote her.
Okay.
But these 3 nuns, I think they were from New York City. They were somewhere up north. They just felt so bad for her. And they were just like, that should have never happened. You should have been able to go to your pastor and confess and, to unburden your soul like she thought she was doing without the fear of him taking it anywhere else. And so I guess where I kind of land on that is it's situational because if a man had killed his wife out of just meanness and he just wanted to unburden himself, I think they should go to the cops. She was being abused.
But that puts you in the position of being the judge there, of whether you think that person's guilty or not of, you know what I'm saying?
I do, but I think in those days, too, there was so much at stake. It wasn't like today where they're just going to go to prison for worst case scenario, they're going to prison. Back then, worst case scenario, you're losing your life.
Yeah. Well, it's still, this is what it leaves me wondering.
Yeah.
I wonder how many people have confessed to their pastors or priests. It makes me wonder, is there training in theological seminary about those ethical issues like that?
So I'll just close with a poem that Alma Petty Gatlin wrote while she was in jail about her mother. The first word I learned to say, the one I saw first every day, the one who kissed my tears away, that blessed one was mother. One who loved me all the time, not e'er a thought was in her mind, except to be so good and kind, my dear and loving mother. She who taught me how to pray, how in kindness to repay, even friends who would betray, blessed sainted mother. Always ready to sacrifice, always ready to pay the price. How thankful I shall always be that God gave her just to me, and at the end I will be with my precious mother.
Aw, that's really
I know.
sweet. Those sure were some hard times.
Yes, they were.
We've all had things that we've needed to get off our chest. But if you've committed some type of heinous crime and need somebody to talk to, subscribe to Hard Times and True Crimes and download every episode. And then you can call me direct at 867-5309. And don't worry, I'll never change my number. And if it does make it into one of our episodes, we'll change the names and locations. Mostly so we don't have to pay you. Till next time, goodbye.